Rome burns. The eternal city, the heart of an empire that once stretched from the chilly hills of Britain all the way to the warm sands of Egypt, is trembling. Imagine the sound of footsteps echoing through ancient streets as invaders enter gates that had stood for centuries. It is not just the end of a city. Something much bigger is happening, the closing chapter of a whole age. But how did the world reach this point? Why did a civilization, admired and even feared for so long, suddenly seem so fragile? Let's step back in time together. Picture yourself in Rome's bustling markets, hearing the mix of languages and watching senators in their white togas as children play near grand fountains. For hundreds of years, Rome stood as a symbol of strength and order. Its roads crisscrossed continents, and its laws reached into the daily lives of millions. Yet, as the 3rd century after Christ arrived, cracks began to appear. The empire grew so large that even the swiftest messengers struggled to carry news from one end to the other. Corruption quietly seeped into the government, and leaders came and went with astonishing speed. There were years when Rome saw more than 20 emperors rise and fall, many betrayed by those they trusted most. Here's a curiosity that may surprise you. Some emperors ruled for only a few months, their names barely remembered even by their own people. The throne, once a seat of glory, had become a dangerous game. Outside the city walls, new challenges were approaching. Entire peoples, the Goths, the Vandals, and others, were moving across the landscape, searching for safety and a better life. They were not just warriors, but families, children, and elders, all on the move because of fearsome horsemen sweeping down from the east. These newcomers were often called barbarians, but in truth, many sought peace and even became allies of Rome before conflict tore those fragile bonds apart. And as the empire struggled with its own weight, another quiet transformation was underway. In hidden rooms and candlelit gatherings, the message of Christianity was spreading. Once, followers of this new faith had to hide from soldiers. Now their ideas were inspiring hope and change, reaching even the emperor himself. So, as Rome's fires fade to embers and the world stands at a crossroads, we find ourselves asking, was the fall of this mighty city really the end? Or was it the beginning of something new? If you are as fascinated by these stories as we are, remember to like this video, share it with friends who love history, and subscribe to Legacy of Empires. Together, we will keep exploring the incredible tales and legacies that the ancient world has left behind. Picture this. It's the 3rd century after Christ, and the most powerful empire the world has ever known is slowly tearing itself apart from the inside. Rome, the city that once seemed destined to rule forever, is facing its darkest hour. The empire that had conquered lands from Britain to the deserts of Africa was now drowning in its own success. Think about it. Rome had grown so vast that it became almost impossible to govern. Messages from the frontiers took months to reach the capital, and by the time emperors could respond to crises, new ones had already erupted elsewhere. But the real poison eating away at Rome's heart was something far more personal: greed and betrayal. The very soldiers who were supposed to protect the empire had become its greatest threat. These weren't foreign invaders we're talking about. These were Roman legions turning against their own leaders whenever it suited them. Here's where the story gets truly fascinating. Between the years 235 and 284 after Christ, something absolutely extraordinary happened. Rome cycled through more than 20 emperors in just 50 years. That's almost one new ruler every 2.5 years. Most of these men didn't die peacefully in their beds. They were murdered, often by the very soldiers who had sworn to protect them. Imagine being an emperor during this time. You wake up each morning not knowing if today might be your last. Your own bodyguards might be plotting against you, your generals could be planning a coup, and somewhere out there, another ambitious commander is probably marching toward Rome with promises of better pay for the troops. The economic situation was just as devastating. Rome had been funding its massive military and bureaucracy by constantly debasing its currency, essentially printing more money but with less actual silver or gold in each coin. This created inflation so severe that a loaf of bread that cost 1 coin at the beginning of the century might cost 50 coins by the end. People lost faith not just in the currency, but in the entire system. What makes this period even more tragic is that many of these short-lived emperors were actually capable men who might have been great leaders under different circumstances. Take Emperor Aurelian, for example. He managed to reunify the empire and defeat several barbarian invasions, earning him the title Restorer of the World. But even he couldn't escape the cycle of violence. He was assassinated by his own officers who feared he was becoming too strict with discipline. The empire had become trapped in a vicious cycle. Weak leadership led to military problems, which led to economic troubles, which led to political instability, which led to even weaker leadership. Each new emperor faced the same impossible challenge. How do you fix a system when the very act of trying to fix it might get you killed? This wasn't just a political crisis. It was a crisis of identity. Romans had always believed they were destined to rule the world, that their empire was eternal and blessed by the gods. But now, as they watched emperor after emperor fall, as barbarian tribes pressed ever closer to their borders, and as their money became worthless, many began to wonder if perhaps the gods had abandoned them. The 3rd century crisis revealed something profound about power and human nature. Rome had built the greatest military machine in history, but that same machine eventually turned inward and began devouring the very thing it was meant to protect. The empire that had conquered the world couldn't conquer its own internal demons. This period set the stage for everything that would follow: the rise of Christianity, the great migrations of barbarian peoples, and ultimately the transformation of the ancient world into something entirely new. The Rome that emerged from this crisis would be different in almost every way, and the seeds of both its temporary recovery and its eventual fall were planted in these chaotic 50 years. The story of Rome's 3rd century crisis reminds us that even the mightiest civilizations are fragile, and that sometimes the greatest threats come not from outside enemies, but from the corruption and division within. Now, here's where our story takes a fascinating turn that completely changes how we think about the fall of Rome. For centuries, historians painted these events as simple invasions, wild barbarian hordes sweeping down to destroy civilization. But the truth is far more complex and, honestly, far more human. Picture the 4th and 5th centuries after Christ as a time of massive upheaval across all of Europe and Asia. It wasn't just Rome that was struggling. Entire peoples were on the move, fleeing from something even more terrifying than the Roman legions. Far to the east, a confederation of nomadic warriors called the Huns was pushing westward, and their reputation for fierce warfare preceded them like a shadow. The Gothic peoples, who had lived peacefully along the Danube River for generations, suddenly found themselves caught between 2 impossible choices: face the approaching Huns or seek refuge within Roman territory. These weren't mindless raiders looking for quick plunder. These were entire nations, complete with families, elders, children, and all their possessions, desperately searching for a new home. What happened next reveals something profound about human nature and the fragility of political agreements. The Gothic leaders approached Roman Emperor Valens in the year 376 after Christ with what seemed like a reasonable proposal. They offered to serve as soldiers for Rome in exchange for land and protection. Rome, always in need of fresh recruits for its armies, agreed to this arrangement. But here's where the story becomes truly heartbreaking. As tens of thousands of Gothic refugees crossed into Roman territory, they were met not with the hospitality promised, but with exploitation and cruelty. Roman officials, seeing an opportunity for personal profit, began selling rotten food to the starving Goths at outrageous prices. Some Gothic families were forced to sell their own children into slavery just to buy enough grain to survive. The breaking point came when Gothic leaders were invited to a feast by Roman commanders. What should have been a gesture of friendship turned into an attempted massacre. The Romans tried to murder their guests during the dinner, but several Gothic leaders escaped. Word spread quickly through the refugee camps, and desperation turned to fury. Within months, the same Gothic warriors who had offered to fight for Rome were now fighting against it. The irony is almost too painful to imagine. Rome had created its own enemies through betrayal and greed. In the year 378 after Christ, these betrayed allies defeated and killed Emperor Valens himself at the Battle of Adrianople, one of the worst military disasters in Roman history. But the Gothic story doesn't end there, and this is where it gets even more remarkable. Among the survivors of this betrayal was a young Gothic leader named Alaric. He had actually served in the Roman army as a young man, fighting alongside Roman soldiers and learning their tactics. He understood Roman culture, spoke Latin, and had once dreamed of rising through the ranks to become a Roman general. For decades, Alaric tried to find a peaceful solution. He negotiated with emperor after emperor, seeking only what had been promised to his people originally: land where they could settle and recognition of their service to Rome. Time and again, Roman leaders made promises they had no intention of keeping. They would agree to terms, then refuse to honor them once the immediate crisis had passed. Finally, in the year 410 after Christ, Alaric's patience ran out. He led his followers to the gates of Rome itself, not as a conqueror seeking glory, but as a desperate leader who had exhausted all other options. When he demanded supplies for his starving people, the Roman Senate initially refused, reportedly saying they would rather die than negotiate with barbarians. The siege that followed wasn't the work of savage destroyers. Alaric's forces were remarkably disciplined. They avoided damaging churches and actually protected many Roman citizens. This wasn't random destruction. It was a carefully controlled operation designed to force Rome to finally honor its agreements. What makes this story even more fascinating is that other barbarian groups were facing similar situations across the empire. The Vandals, fleeing pressure from the Huns, had moved through Gaul and Spain before settling in North Africa. The Franks were establishing themselves in what would become France. Each group had its own story of migration, desperation, and conflict with Roman authorities. These weren't coordinated invasions. They were separate peoples responding to the same crisis in their own ways. Some, like the Franks, eventually became allies and partners with Rome. Others, like the Vandals, became bitter enemies. The difference often came down to how they were treated when they first sought help. The most remarkable thing about this entire period is how it reveals the power of broken promises. Rome had survived foreign wars, civil conflicts, and economic disasters. But it couldn't survive the loss of trust. When Rome's word became meaningless, when agreements were made only to be broken, the empire lost something more valuable than any army or treasure. It lost its ability to turn enemies into friends. The barbarian migrations remind us that behind every great historical movement are individual human stories of hope, betrayal, survival, and adaptation. These weren't faceless hordes. They were people trying to build new lives in a changing world. Are you fascinated by this ancient collapse? Then comment your thoughts. Like the video, share it with fellow history lovers, and subscribe to Legacy of Empires for more epic journeys. Picture this. While emperors were fighting for power and barbarian armies were gathering at the borders, something extraordinary was happening in the shadows of the Roman Empire. A quiet revolution was spreading through the ancient world, one that would outlast every legion and survive every conquest. Christianity had started as a small, persecuted movement. For nearly 3 centuries, Christians had to worship in secret, meeting in underground catacombs beneath Rome's streets. They faced terrible persecution under emperors like Nero and Diocletian, who saw this new faith as a threat to Roman traditions and the worship of their gods. But here's what's fascinating. The more Rome tried to suppress this faith, the stronger it became. Every act of persecution only seemed to create more believers. By the early 4th century after Christ, despite centuries of official hostility, Christianity had quietly spread throughout the empire like water seeping through cracks in ancient stone. Then came the moment that changed everything. In the year 312 after Christ, a Roman general named Constantine was preparing for the most important battle of his life. He was marching on Rome itself, ready to claim the imperial throne. The night before the decisive battle of the Milvian Bridge, something happened that would reshape the entire ancient world. Constantine claimed he saw a vision in the sky, a cross of light with the words, "In this sign, conquer." Whether you believe it was divine intervention or a brilliant political calculation, Constantine ordered his soldiers to paint Christian symbols on their shields. They won the battle, and Constantine became emperor. But Constantine's conversion wasn't just a personal decision. It was a seismic shift that sent shockwaves through every corner of the empire. Imagine being a Christian who had spent your entire life hiding your faith, and suddenly the most powerful man in the world was building churches and calling himself a follower of Christ. The transformation was remarkable. Temples that had stood for centuries dedicated to Jupiter and Mars began to empty. The old rituals that had bound Roman society together for 1,000 years started to feel outdated. Priests who had once enjoyed enormous prestige found themselves struggling to maintain relevance in a world that was rapidly changing its spiritual allegiances. What makes this story even more incredible is what happened next. As the old pagan learning centers closed down and the classical world began to crumble, it was Christian monks who became the unlikely guardians of ancient wisdom. In monasteries scattered across Europe, these devout men spent countless hours copying and preserving the works of Plato, Aristotle, and Cicero. Think about the beautiful irony here. The very people who represented the new faith that was replacing the old world became the ones who saved that world's greatest intellectual treasures. Without these patient monks working by candlelight in their scriptoriums, we might have lost forever the philosophical works that had shaped human thought for centuries. These monasteries became like intellectual arks, sailing through the storm of the empire's collapse with precious cargo aboard. The monks didn't just copy Christian texts. They preserved Roman legal codes, Greek mathematical treatises, and philosophical dialogues that would later spark the Renaissance more than 1,000 years later. Christianity's rise also changed how people thought about power itself. The old Roman idea was that emperors were divine, that they ruled by their own strength and the favor of the gods. But Christianity introduced a radical new concept, that even the mightiest ruler was accountable to a higher authority. This idea would echo through the centuries, eventually helping to shape concepts of limited government and human rights. The spread of Christianity also created the first truly international network of the medieval world. A Christian in Britain could travel to a monastery in Ireland, then to Rome, then to Constantinople, and find communities that shared common beliefs, practices, and even languages. Latin became the scholarly language that connected educated people across vast distances. Perhaps most remarkably, Christianity survived not just the fall of Rome, but actually grew stronger because of it. When the Western Empire collapsed in 476, the Church provided continuity and stability in a world that had lost its political center. Bishops often became the real leaders in their communities, organizing everything from food distribution to defense against raiders. This quiet revolution that had started in the catacombs beneath Rome ended up outlasting the empire itself. It created a new foundation for European civilization and preserved the wisdom of the ancient world for future generations. Sometimes the most profound changes happen not through conquest or legislation, but through the gradual transformation of hearts and minds, one person at a time. Picture this. It's the year 476. And somewhere in the crumbling halls of what was once the mightiest palace in the Western world, a teenage boy sits on a throne that has become nothing more than an expensive chair. His name is Romulus Augustulus, and he doesn't know it yet, but he's about to become the answer to one of history's most famous questions. Who was the last Roman emperor in the West? The irony of his name is almost too perfect to believe. Romulus, named after the legendary founder of Rome itself, and Augustulus, a diminutive form of Augustus, the title that once struck fear and commanded respect across 3 continents. But this Romulus isn't founding anything, and there's nothing august about his situation. His enemies mockingly call him Augustulus, which basically means Little Augustus. And honestly, they're not wrong. Here's something that might surprise you. This boy emperor didn't lose his throne in some epic final battle with barbarian hordes charging through the gates of Rome. There were no dramatic last stands, no heroic speeches, no Caesar crossing any Rubicon. Instead, the end came through what was essentially a bureaucratic takeover by a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer. Odoacer was actually quite practical about the whole thing. He'd been serving as a military commander in the Roman army, like many Germanic leaders of his time. These weren't wild savages from beyond civilization's edge. They were people who had lived within the Roman system, understood how it worked, and frankly could see that it wasn't working very well anymore. When Odoacer decided he'd had enough of playing second fiddle to a powerless puppet emperor, he simply walked into the palace and informed young Romulus that his services were no longer required. The fascinating thing is what Odoacer did next. He didn't declare himself emperor. He didn't try to restore some ancient Germanic kingdom. Instead, he sent the imperial regalia, the crown and purple robes that symbolized Roman authority, back to Constantinople, to the Eastern emperor. It was like saying, "Look, we don't need a separate Western emperor anymore. You can handle the whole empire from over there." Of course, the Eastern emperor was hundreds of miles away and had no real power in Italy, so this was essentially Odoacer's polite way of declaring independence while maintaining the fiction of Roman unity. What happened to poor Romulus Augustulus? Well, here's where the story takes an unexpectedly gentle turn. Odoacer, rather than having the boy killed as was common practice with deposed rulers, actually gave him a pension and let him retire to a villa in Campania. Some sources suggest he may have even become a monk later in life. Imagine that. The last Western Roman emperor, spending his final years tending gardens and copying manuscripts in some peaceful monastery, probably telling the younger monks stories about the time he wore the purple. But here's the thing that really gets me about this moment in history. Nobody at the time thought they were witnessing the end of an age. The people living through 476 didn't wake up that morning thinking, "Today the ancient world ends and the medieval period begins." Life just continued. People still spoke Latin, Roman laws were still enforced, and many of the same administrators kept their jobs under the new management. The Roman Senate actually continued to meet for decades after Odoacer took power. Can you imagine? These senators, descendants of men who had once debated the fate of nations, now gathered to discuss local municipal issues while a Germanic king held the real power. It's almost heartbreakingly absurd when you think about it. And here's something that blows my mind every time I think about it. While the Western Empire was breathing its last, the Eastern half was actually doing pretty well. The emperor in Constantinople controlled wealthy territories, commanded powerful armies, and would continue calling himself Roman Emperor for another 1,000 years. The Byzantine Empire, as we call it now, didn't consider itself a separate entity. To them, they were still Romans, and they were still living in the Roman Empire. The West hadn't fallen, it had just been temporarily lost, and would someday be reclaimed. The strangest part of this whole story might be how anticlimactic it all was. For over 1,000 years, Rome had been the center of the Western world. It had survived civil wars, plagues, economic collapses, and invasion after invasion. And then it just ended. Not with fire and sword, but with a teenager being politely asked to step down by a practical-minded barbarian who promised him a comfortable retirement. Sometimes I wonder what that final conversation between Odoacer and Romulus Augustulus was like. Did the old Germanic warrior feel any weight of history in that moment? Did the boy understand what was ending? Or was it just another day in a world that had been falling apart so gradually that nobody noticed when it finally hit the ground? The truth is, the end of the Western Roman Empire wasn't really an ending at all. It was more like a transformation, a slow metamorphosis that had been happening for generations. The ancient world didn't die in 476. It just finally admitted what everyone already knew. The future belonged to someone else. So here we are, standing at the end of our journey through the collapse of the ancient world. But you know what's fascinating? The story doesn't actually end with the fall of Rome. In fact, in many ways, That's where the most incredible chapter begins. Think about this for a moment. When the last Western Roman emperor stepped down in 476, people didn't suddenly stop being Roman. They didn't wake up the next morning speaking different languages or following completely different laws. The empire had fallen, but its DNA was already woven so deeply into the fabric of European civilization that it couldn't just disappear. Let me tell you something that absolutely amazes me. Walk into any courthouse in America today, and you'll see concepts that would be instantly recognizable to a Roman lawyer from 1500 years ago. The idea of innocent until proven guilty, the right to legal representation, the concept of precedent where past decisions guide future ones, these all trace their roots back to Roman legal thinking. When medieval kings wanted to legitimize their rule, they didn't invent new legal systems. They reached back to Roman law because everyone understood that Rome represented the gold standard of governance. And here's something that gives me chills every time I think about it. The Latin language that Roman soldiers once shouted in the battlefields of Gaul became the language of science, medicine, and scholarship for over 1,000 years after Rome fell. When medieval monks carefully copied ancient texts in their monasteries, they were writing in Latin. When Renaissance scientists like Copernicus revolutionized our understanding of the cosmos, they published their discoveries in Latin. Even today, when doctors write prescriptions or biologists name new species, they're using the language of Caesar and Cicero. But perhaps the most extraordinary transformation happened with Christianity. Remember, this was a religion that Rome initially tried to crush, feeding Christians to lions in the Colosseum for entertainment. Yet by the time the Western Empire fell, Christian bishops had become some of the most powerful people in the former Roman territories. They didn't just adopt Roman organizational structures, they became the inheritors of Roman authority itself. Picture this incredible scene. In the city of Rome, long after the last emperor had gone, the Pope was essentially functioning as the city's ruler. The same Vatican Hill where Roman emperors once held court became the center of a spiritual empire that would eventually reach further than Roman legions ever had. The irony is almost poetic. Christianity didn't just survive Rome's collapse, it filled the vacuum that Rome left behind. Here's something that might surprise you. Many of the Germanic kings who carved up the former Western Empire desperately wanted to be seen as legitimate Roman successors. Charlemagne, the great Frankish king, didn't call himself the first Holy Roman Emperor. He genuinely believed he was restoring the Roman Empire. When he was crowned by the Pope in the year 800, it wasn't seen as creating something new, but as bringing back something that had been temporarily lost. Even more fascinating, the Eastern Roman Empire, what we call the Byzantine Empire, never stopped considering itself Roman. For another 1,000 years after the West fell, Byzantine emperors in Constantinople called themselves Emperor of the Romans and dreamed of reconquering Italy. They spoke Greek, followed Eastern Orthodox Christianity, and lived in a world that would have seemed alien to Julius Caesar, yet they maintained an unbroken chain of succession back to Augustus himself. Now here's the big question that historians have been wrestling with for centuries. Could Rome have been saved? Was this collapse inevitable, or did specific choices and circumstances doom the empire? I think about this a lot, and honestly, it keeps me up at night sometimes. There were so many moments where things could have gone differently. What if the empire had found a better way to integrate Germanic peoples instead of treating them as perpetual outsiders? What if they'd managed their finances better and avoided the crushing inflation that destroyed their economy? What if they'd been able to maintain political stability instead of cycling through dozens of emperors in the span of a few decades? Some historians argue that Rome got too big for its own good, that it was simply impossible to govern such a vast territory with ancient communication and transportation technology. Others point to specific policy failures or the rise of Christianity as fundamentally changing Roman values. But here's what I find most compelling. Rome didn't really die. It evolved. The medieval kingdoms that emerged from Rome's ashes weren't completely alien civilizations. They were Rome's children, carrying forward Roman laws, Roman administrative practices, and Roman dreams of universal empire. The Holy Roman Empire lasted for almost 1,000 years. The Russian czars claimed to be the successors of Caesar. Even Napoleon styled himself as a new Augustus. And what about us today? What can we learn from Rome's transformation? I think the lesson isn't about preventing collapse, but about understanding that civilizations are living things that grow, change, and adapt. Rome didn't fail because it was weak. It failed because it couldn't adapt quickly enough to a rapidly changing world. Think about our own time. We live in an era of incredible technological change, shifting global power dynamics, and new challenges that our existing institutions weren't designed to handle. Climate change, artificial intelligence, global pandemics, these are the barbarians at our gates. The question isn't whether our current systems will change, it's whether they'll transform gracefully or collapse chaotically. Rome's story teaches us that endings can also be beginnings, that the values and achievements of a civilization can survive even when its political structures don't, that sometimes what looks like catastrophic failure is actually a necessary transformation that allows the best parts of a culture to spread even further than they could have under the old system. So was Rome's fall inevitable? Maybe. But was it a tragedy? I'm not so sure. Because in falling, Rome gave birth to 1,000 different experiments in governance, culture, and human organization. The medieval world was messier and more chaotic than the Roman Empire, but it was also more diverse, more innovative, and ultimately more dynamic. The ancient world ended, but its soul lives on in every courthouse, every university, every church, and every government building across the globe. Rome fell, but in falling, it became immortal. What do you think? Could Rome have been saved, or was this transformation always meant to happen? And what lessons does this ancient story hold for our modern world? And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Legacy of Empires for more untold stories of the ancient world. The conversation doesn't end here. It continues with every person who learns from the past to build a better future. Share your thoughts, dive deeper into these ancient mysteries, and keep exploring the incredible stories that shaped our world. Because understanding where we came from is the first step to deciding where we want to go.